The distress signal came through like a whisper from the dead. It flickered across the communications board of the GCS Athena's Mercy in broken pulses, each one weaker than the last, each one carrying a language that made every translator on the bridge hesitate before rendering it into galactic standard. Keth Communications Officer Liul was the first to notice it, and the color drained from his amphibian skin the moment he recognized the encryption pattern. "Captain," he said, his voice barely above a croak, "that signal is Vorthon." The bridge went silent in a way that only a ship full of prey species could go silent. Not the calm quiet of focus, but the frozen stillness of animals who had just heard a branch snap in the dark. Captain Yul Thyra stood at the center of the bridge, her tall and slender Fellini frame perfectly still, her large dark eyes fixed on the view screen where the source of the signal blinked like a dying star against the black field of the asteroid belt ahead of them. She was a good captain, calm and wise and fair, but she was also a Fellini, and the Fellini were a cervine species whose entire evolutionary history had been shaped by running from things with claws and teeth. The Vorthon had both in abundance. They were not members of the Galactic Coalition, and for good reason, standing nearly 3 meters tall, covered in obsidian black chitin armor that grew from their own bodies, with 4 clawed arms, and bioluminescent threat displays that could paralyze smaller creatures with fear. The Vorthon were classified as a Tier 1 predator species. Contact was officially discouraged and unofficially feared beyond measure. "Can you determine the nature of the signal?" the captain asked, and her voice was steady, even though her pulse was not. Liul worked his console with trembling webbed fingers and shook his head. "It is a standard distress beacon, Captain, but it is old. Weeks old at least. And the power source is failing. The vessel appears to be adrift in the asteroid field, at coordinates 773 by 419. Life signs." The Dreth engineer, crystallographer Ven, answered from her station, her crystalline plates shifting with soft, chiming sounds that betrayed her unease. "Minimal power signature from the vessel. No active systems, but there are faint thermal clusters in what appears to be a cargo hold. Small ones, Captain. Too small to be adult Vorthon." That detail hung in the air like smoke. Too small to be adults. In the back of the bridge, standing near the auxiliary medical station, because that was where they had put her, since nobody quite knew what else to do with a human on a diplomatic frigate, Specialist Marin Cole looked up from her datapad. She was the only human aboard the Athena's Mercy, assigned as part of a cultural exchange program that most of the crew quietly regarded as a mistake. Not because Marin was unpleasant, but because humans were strange in ways that made other species uncomfortable. They smiled when they were nervous, and they ran toward loud noises instead of away from them, and they had a deeply unsettling habit of forming emotional bonds with anything that moved and several things that did not. Marin was 31 years old, with brown skin and dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, and hands that were always busy, always fixing something, or holding something, or reaching for something. She had trained as a field medic and xenobiologist, and she had volunteered for the exchange program because she wanted to understand the galaxy, not just read about it. "I will go," she said. Every head on the bridge turned toward her. Captain Yul Thyra blinked her large eyes slowly, which was the Fellini equivalent of raising an eyebrow. "Specialist Cole, we have not yet decided whether to investigate at all. The signal is weeks old," Marin said, standing and slipping her datapad into her belt. "And whatever is in that cargo hold has been running on emergency power the entire time. If there are survivors, they do not have long." "If there are survivors," Gorath rumbled from a security station, "they are Vorthon." Gorath was a Pelvari, a massive 6-legged herbivore species covered in thick natural armor plates, and he was the closest thing the Athena's Mercy had to a warrior, though even he had never faced a Vorthon in person, and had no desire to change that. Even hatchlings are dangerous, he continued, his deep voice vibrating through the deck. Vorthon young have been documented as capable of— I read the same files you did, Marin interrupted gently, and I am still volunteering. The captain studied her for a long moment, and Marin could see the war playing out behind those dark eyes. Duty against instinct, protocol against fear, until, finally, Yilthara gave a slow nod. Assemble a boarding team, Specialist Cole, Crystallographer Ven, Officer Gorath, and Communications Officer Leal. Standard away team equipment and full environmental suits. You have 2 hours. The docking was rough. The Vorthon vessel was a mid-sized transport, and it hung in the asteroid field like a corpse in dark water. No running lights, no engine glow, nothing but cold metal and silence. The airlock protested when Ven forced it open, and the air that rushed out was stale and thin, and carried with it the sharp chemical smell of old weapons fire. They moved through the corridors in tight formation, Gorath at the front with his sidearm drawn, Ven scanning for structural integrity, Leal recording everything, and Marin in the middle, where they had put her because she was the smallest and the least armored, and supposedly the most vulnerable. The ship told its own story as they walked. Blast marks scarred the walls in long black streaks, and several bulkheads had been blown inward, not from the outside, but from within. And in one corridor they found claw gouges in the metal that were so deep, Marin could fit her entire hand inside them. Whatever had happened here had been violent and desperate and final. The thermal signatures are ahead, Ven reported, her crystalline body throwing faint prismatic light across the ruined walls. Behind that cargo door. Gorath positioned himself in front of the door and looked back at the team with an expression that clearly said he thought this was a terrible idea. Marin nodded at him. He opened the door. The cargo hold was dark, except for a single failing heat lamp in the far corner, its orange glow flickering and sputtering as it pulled the last energy from the ship's dying emergency battery. And beneath that lamp, huddled together in a trembling pile, were 7 Vorthon hatchlings, the monsters from the Coalition briefings. Each one was no larger than a human toddler, their chitons still soft and pale and almost translucent. Their 4 small arms wrapped around each other, their bioluminescent markings flickering weakly like candle flames in the wind. They were shaking. They were starving. They were terrified. Gorath took one look and stepped backward, his hand tightening on his sidearm until his armored knuckles cracked. Luel made a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a whimper, and pressed himself against the wall. Ven's crystalline plates rattled so loudly it sounded like wind chimes in a storm. Every instinct in every alien on that team, millions of years of evolution, screaming through their blood and bones and neurons, said the same thing. Predator. Run. Marin Cole stepped forward. She walked past Gorath's outstretched arm, and past Ven's rattling frame, and past Luel's frozen body, crossed the cargo hold with steady steps until she was close enough to see the hatchlings' tiny translucent fangs and the fear in their pale, undeveloped eyes. One of them hissed at her, a small and pitiful sound, like a kitten trying to roar. The smallest one in the center of the pile tried to raise its threat display, and the bioluminescent patches along its back flickered once and then went dark, and then it collapsed sideways into the arms of its siblings and did not move again. Marin knelt down on the cold metal floor of a dead ship, surrounded by the children of the most feared predators in the galaxy, and she did what humans have always done when they find something small and scared and alone in the dark. The hatchling that had collapsed was barely breathing. Marin could see the faint rise and fall of its pale chest, each breath shallow and uneven, each one a little weaker than the one before it. And she knew with the certainty of someone who had spent years studying alien biology that this creature had hours left at most. Behind her, the away team had not moved. Goreth still had his sidearm half raised, and his 6 legs were planted in the wide defensive stance that Pelvari used when they were preparing to charge or flee, and had not yet decided which. "Cole," he said, and his voice was low and tight, "step back. We do not know what they are capable of." "They are capable of dying," Marin said without turning around, "which is what they are doing right now." She pulled off her environmental gloves and held her bare hand near the nearest hatchling, not touching, just offering warmth, and she watched as the tiny creature flinched and then leaned toward her fingers, the way a freezing person leans toward a fire. Vorthon hatchlings were endothermic, but their xenobiology files said they could not regulate their own body temperature during their first year of life. They depended entirely on external heat sources, on the warmth of their clan, on the bodies of adults who would curl around them and keep them alive through the cold. These hatchlings had no adults. They had been alone in this freezing cargo hold for weeks, huddled under a failing heat lamp, burning through the last of their energy reserves, just trying to stay alive. Marin activated her comlink back to the Athena's Mercy. "Captain, I need emergency thermal blankets, a portable heating unit, and access to the ship's nutritional synthesis database, specifically the Vorthon metabolic profile. I need it now." There was a pause on the other end that lasted just a beat too long before the captain responded. "Specialist Cole, we are still assessing the situation. There are protocols regarding contact with Vorthon." "Captain," Marin said, and her voice was not angry or desperate, but simply clear and absolute in the way that only a human voice could be when a human had decided something. "They are babies. They are cold and hungry and scared, and they will die in the next 6 hours without intervention. I do not care what species they are." Another pause. Then Yelthira's voice came back, quieter now. "Sending the supplies to the airlock." Marin got to work. She stripped off her outer jacket and wrapped it around the collapsed hatchling first, tucking the small body against her own torso where her human body heat, warmer than most species in the coalition by several degrees, could begin to seep into the creature's failing system. The hatchling's skin was cool and papery against her arms, and she could feel the faint flutter of its heartbeat, too fast and too weak, like a bird trapped inside a glass jar. The other 6 hatchlings watched her with wide, pale eyes. They did not understand what she was. She was not Vorthon, she was not a predator, she was not anything they had ever seen before, and their instincts were confused, caught between fear and the desperate animal need for warmth and comfort. One of them hissed at her again. Another reached out with a tiny clawed hand and grabbed the edge of her sleeve and held on tight. When the supplies arrived at the airlock, it was Ven who carried them in, the Dreth engineer moving stiffly, her crystalline plates still chiming with stress, but her hands steady as she set the heating unit down near Marin and began connecting it to the remaining power supply without being asked. Marin looked at her. "Thank you." Ven's plates shifted in what might have been embarrassment. "My species was historically prey to a creature similar to the Vorthon," she said. "Part of my biology is telling me to leave this room, but you are clearly going to stay regardless, and someone needs to make sure the heating unit does not explode." Marin almost smiled. She arranged the thermal blankets into a nest around the heating unit, and began transferring the hatchlings one by one into the warm space, and each time she picked one up, it squirmed and snapped at her hands with tiny translucent teeth that were sharp enough to draw blood. The third hatchling bit her hard enough to break the skin on her forearm, and Marin hissed through her teeth and kept moving, settling the creature gently into the nest, where it immediately burrowed into the warmth and went still. Leol, watching from the doorway, made a strangled sound. "You are bleeding." "I noticed," Marin said. "Does it not? Are you not afraid?" Marin paused and looked at the communications officer, at his wide amphibian eyes and his trembling hands, and the way his entire body was pressed against the doorframe, as if he might bolt at any moment. "I am afraid," she said simply. "But they are more afraid than I am, and they are smaller than I am, and someone has to help them." On the bridge of the Athena's Mercy, the crew watched the cargo hold feed in something close to stunned silence. Captain Yothara had called an emergency meeting, but it had devolved into barely controlled chaos. A dozen species all talking at once, all of them afraid, all of them pulling in different directions. The Talari botanist, a tall photosynthetic being named Sorrel, who communicated through patterns of light across her leaf-like skin, argued that they had no obligation to predator young, and that the risk to the crew was unacceptable. A Mivari counselor, a small empathic mammalian creature named Pit, was curled in the corner with his paws over his ears, overwhelmed by the waves of primal terror radiating from every prey species on ship. "We should report the beacon to Coalition Command and continue on our route," Sorrel flashed, her bioluminescent skin pulsing in sharp, irritated patterns. "This is not our responsibility." "They are children," said a quiet voice from the back of the room, and everyone turned to see the ship's medical officer, a Philini named Dr. Hassin, standing with her arms folded and her ears pressed flat against her skull, in the posture of a Philini who was terrified but refusing to show it. "Whatever they will grow into," Hassin continued, "right now they are children, and we found them, and that makes them our responsibility whether we like it or not." The argument continued, voices rising and falling, but through it all, the feed from the cargo hold played on the main screen. And through it all, the crew watched the human. They watched her arrange blankets, and synthesize nutrient paste, and check temperatures, and wipe blood from her bitten hands, without pausing. They watched the way she talked to the hatchlings, in a low, steady voice, even though they could not understand her. And they watched the way she held the smallest one against her chest, and breathed slowly and deliberately, so that the rhythm of her breathing might give the dying creature something to hold on to. Humans were strange. Every species in the coalition agreed on this. Humans were confusing and contradictory and impossible to predict. But watching Marin Cole in that cargo hold, the crew of the Athena's Mercy began to understand something that no xenobiology textbook had ever quite captured. Humans were not fearless. Anyone who had ever seen a human flinch at a loud noise or jump at a shadow knew that. But they had something else. Something that no other species in the known galaxy seemed to possess in quite the same way. They could be afraid and still move forward. They could feel every instinct screaming at them to run, and simply decide that running was not an option because something more important was happening right here and right now. It was not bravery exactly, it was something deeper, something more stubborn, something woven into the very core of what it meant to be human. Back in the cargo hold, Marin had gotten all 7 hatchlings into the thermal nest, and the nutrient paste was ready, a thick protein-rich mixture that she had adjusted 3 times based on Vorthon metabolic data, getting the amino acid profile as close to correct as the ship's limited synthesizer would allow. She fed them one at a time, squeezing small amounts of the paste onto her finger and holding it near their mouths, and most of them ate greedily, their small fangs scraping against her skin as they licked the paste clean. The smallest hatchling would not eat. It lay in the center of the nest where Marin had placed it, wrapped in her jacket, and its breathing was getting worse. Longer pauses between each breath, longer stretches of terrible stillness. Marin set down the nutrient paste and picked the hatchling up and held it against her chest again, and she could feel how light it was, how fragile, how close to the edge of something that could not be undone. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on, stay with me." The hatchling's bioluminescence flickered once, a faint pale glow that traveled across its translucent chitin like lightning seen from very far away, and then it went dark, and then it stopped breathing. Marin did not hesitate. She laid the hatchling on the flattest surface she could find, and placed her hands on its tiny chest, and began compressions. adjusting her pressure for the creature's size and fragile bone structure, counting under her breath, the way she had been trained, pushing life back into a body that was trying to let go. Then was beside her in an instant, scanning the hatchling's vitals with shaking crystalline hands. "Temperature is still dropping," Then said, "even with the heating unit." "Then we need more heat," Marin said between compressions. "Get the other hatchlings closer. Body heat, all of them, now." Luel rushed forward and began moving the other hatchlings. And Gorath appeared in the doorway and stood there watching with an expression that no one on the crew had ever seen on a Pelvari face before. Not fear, not anger, but something raw and unguarded that had no name in his language. Marin kept pushing, one compression after another, steady and relentless, her hands on the chest of a predator's child, in the dark and cold of a dead ship. 11 minutes passed, and then the smallest hatchling gasped, a tiny ragged intake of breath that sounded like the first cry of something being born. And its bioluminescence flared to life, not the pale flicker of before, but a warm and steady glow that spread across its entire body like sunrise. Up and held it close, and felt it breathe against her neck. And she closed her eyes, and she did not cry, because there was still too much work to do. But it was close. The hatchlings came aboard the Athena's Mercy, wrapped in thermal blankets and cradled in the arms of the away team, and the ship had never been so quiet. Crew members pressed themselves against the corridor walls as Marin carried the smallest hatchling past them, their eyes wide, their bodies rigid with the ancient and overwhelming need to flee that lived in the blood of every prey species like a second heartbeat. A Fellini navigation officer named Taylor saw the hatchling's pale clawed hand curl around the edge of Marin's collar, and she collapsed against her console in a full panic attack, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, and her legs folding beneath her until the medical team arrived to sedate her. The ship's empathic counselor Pitt had locked himself in his quarters with noise-canceling barriers over his ears, because the sheer volume of primal terror radiating from half the crew was causing him physical pain. It was chaos, but it was quiet chaos, kind that happens when everyone is too afraid to make noise. Marin converted a section of Cargo Bay 4 into a nursery. She commandeered every spare thermal blanket on the ship, requisitioned a secondary heating unit from engineering, and set up a monitoring station where she could track each hatchling's vital signs on a rotating display. The hatchlings clustered together in their nest of blankets and warmth, their pale bodies piled on top of one another in the instinctive Vorthon formation that the xenobiology texts called a survival huddle, a behavior designed to conserve heat and present a unified threat display to predators, though in this case the display was about as threatening as a basket of kittens with very sharp teeth. Marin named the smallest one Ember. She had not planned to name any of them. Naming them made them real, made them hers, made the whole situation harder and more complicated than it already was. Way of glowing that was different from the others. Where the rest of them flickered and pulsed in sharp, distressed patterns, Ember's bioluminescence was slow and warm, like coals in a fire that refused to go out, and the name came to Marin the way some names do, not chosen, but recognized, as if it had always been there waiting. Ember imprinted on Marin within the first day. This was something the Vorthon behavioral studies had warned about. Hatchlings who lost their clan guardians would bond with the first consistent source of warmth and safety they encountered. But reading about it in a textbook and experiencing it were very different things. Ember followed Marin everywhere. When Marin sat down, Ember climbed into her lap, and when Marin stood up, Ember clung to her leg with all 4 small arms and chirped in protest until Marin picked her up. And when Marin tried to sleep, Ember curled against her side and pressed her face into the human's neck and made a low humming sound that vibrated through Marin's bones. The crew did not know what to make of this. They watched on the security feeds and whispered to each other in the corridors, and the conversations were always the same, half fascination and half horror. Because they had all grown up with stories about the Vorthon, stories about claws and darkness, and the sound of chitin scraping against metal in the night. And none of those stories had included a scene where a Vorthon hatchling fell asleep at a human's arms, making sounds like a purring engine. Marin could not do it alone. 7 hatchlings needed feeding every 4 hours, and each feeding took almost 40 minutes, because the nutrient paste had to be carefully measured and individually adjusted and delivered by hand, since the hatchlings would not eat from any kind of automated dispenser. They needed constant thermal monitoring because a drop of even 2 degrees could send their fragile metabolisms into collapse, into crisis. And they needed stimulation because hatchlings who were not engaged became listless and unresponsive, and slipped toward the same shutdown state that had nearly killed Ember on the derelict ship. On the second day, Marin put out a call for volunteers. Nobody responded. On the third day, crystallographer Ven appeared at the nursery door with a set of improved thermal regulators she had built in her quarters during the night shift. "I was not sleeping anyway," she said, her crystalline plates chiming softly with the residual stress that had not left her body since the cargo hold. "And I thought these might be more efficient than the standard units." She installed them without looking directly at the hatchlings, but when one of them, a slightly larger one that Marin had been calling Flint, crawled over to investigate the new equipment, Ven did not run. She froze, and her plates rang like alarm bells, but she did not run. Moment when Flint lost interest and crawled away. Ven exhaled and said, "Its thermal signature is actually quite beautiful from an engineering perspective." On the 4th day, Luul, the Keth communications officer, discovered something remarkable. He had been running analysis on the hatchlings' vocalizations, purely for scientific purposes, he insisted, and not because he had been watching the nursery feed every night. And he found that the hatchlings responded strongly to low-frequency harmonic vibrations in a specific range. When he played the tones through a small speaker near the nest, the hatchlings stopped their restless chirping and went still, their bioluminescence shifting from sharp distressed flickers to slow rolling waves of color. "It is similar to a frequency used in Vorthon clan songs," Luul explained, his webbed hands moving excitedly over his datapad. "Adult Vorthon produce these vibrations subvocally to calm their young. The hatchlings have been without this stimulus for weeks. They must be." He stopped and looked at the nest, where the 7 hatchlings lay in peaceful, glowing stillness for the first time since they had been found. "They must be so lonely," he finished quietly. After that, Luul came to the nursery every evening and sang. His species had vocal capabilities that could produce the low harmonics the hatchlings needed, and he would sit beside the nest and hum in frequencies that most of the crew could not hear. And the hatchlings would settle and glow, and sometimes one of them would hum back, and Luul would smile in the particular way that Keths smile, which involved their entire face turning a deeper shade of blue. Gorath was the last to come around, and he never fully admitted that he had come around at all. He stationed himself outside the nursery door on the 5th day and told anyone who asked that he was there in a security capacity, that someone needed to protect the crew in case the hatchlings became aggressive, and this was technically true. But it did not explain why he spent his entire shift watching through the viewport with an expression that got softer every day. It did not explain why he brought a spare armor plate from his personal kit and left it near the door where the largest hatchling, a bold and curious one Marin called Ridge, could find it and drag it into the nest as a toy. It definitely did not explain why, when Ridge figured out how to climb out of the nest and toddle to the nursery door and press its face against the viewport and chirp at Gorath, the massive Pelvari security officer looked left and right to make sure no one was watching, and then pressed one of his 6 armored legs against the glass and chirped back. On the 7th day, Liul finished his analysis of the data logs recovered from the derelict Vorthon vessel, and he called a meeting. His face was pale, paler than usual for a Keth. Voice was steady only because he was reading from his notes. The vessel was a refugee ship, he said, carrying a Vorthon clan designated as the Emberkin. They were fleeing an internal conflict within Vorthon territory, a factional war over something the logs call bloodline purity. He paused and swallowed hard. The adults, there were 12 of them, they detected a pursuing warship approximately 3 weeks before we found the beacon. They could not outrun it, and they could not fight it, so they did the only thing they could. His voice cracked. They sealed the hatchlings in the cargo hold with the last of the ship's heat and power, and then they turned the ship around and engaged the enemy vessel directly. They knew they would die. The logs contain final messages from each of the 12 adults, and every single message is addressed to the hatchlings. The room was very still. They are lullabies, Liul said, and now he was crying. Which, for a Keth, meant that tiny droplets of bioluminescent fluid were running down his face and glowing faintly in the dim light of the conference room. Every single one of them is a lullaby. Nobody spoke for a long time after that, because every species in the galaxy, whether they had fur, or scales, or chitin, or crystalline plates, or leaves that drank sunlight, understood one thing, without translation and without explanation. Parents will die for their children. It did not matter that the Vorthon were predators, and it did not matter that the crew of the Athena's Mercy had spent their entire lives fearing them, because in that moment, every person on that ship looked at those hatchlings and saw the same thing. Orphans. Children whose parents had loved them enough to die for them, and who were now alone in the galaxy with no one left to sing them to sleep. Marin was in the nursery when the meeting ended, and she did not know what had been said. But she could feel the weight of it. Even now, she knew something had changed, because over the next hour, every single member of the crew who had protested and argued and demanded the hatchlings be removed from the ship came to the nursery viewport, one by one, and stood there in silence, and watched. Even Saral, the Talari botanist, who had argued loudest against helping, stood at the glass, with her leaf-like skin cycling through colors that Marin had never seen before, soft, muted shades that the Talari used to express grief. That night, Marin sat in the nursery with all 7 hatchlings piled around her, Ember in her lap, and Flint leaning against her arm, and Ridge trying to climb onto her shoulders, and she read aloud from a human children's book she had stored on her datapad, not because the hatchlings could understand the words, but because the sound of her voice made them glow. She was halfway through a story about a bear who lost his hat, when the ship's alarm system screamed to life. Nursery, and the hatchlings shrieked and burrowed into Marin's body, and Captain Yilthira's voice came over the intercom with a tremor in it that Marin had never heard before. All hands to stations. A Vorthon warship has just exited hyperspace directly ahead of us. They are hailing us with a single word. Marin held the hatchlings tighter. The word came through the ship's speakers in the deep resonant growl of the Vorthon language, and the universal translator rendered it into galactic standard with a flatness that did nothing to soften its weight. The Vorthon warship filled the view screen like a mountain that had learned to move through space. It was called the Keth Voron, the Silent Wrath in the old Vorthon tongue, and it was a Predator-class dreadnought, nearly 4 times the size of the Athena's Mercy, bristling with weapon arrays that glowed a deep and angry red against the black of the void. Captain Yilthira stood at the center of her bridge and felt every instinct she had ever inherited from a million years of Phaelini evolution telling her to run. Her legs wanted to fold, her heart wanted to burst, and her mind wanted to shut down the way a deer's mind shuts down in the final second before the jaws close. that strange and terrible mercy that evolution gives to creatures who were never meant to fight. But she was a captain, and she had a crew, and so she stood. "Open a channel," she said. The face that appeared on the view screen was a nightmare given flesh. War Matriarch Sci-Fi was enormous, even by Vorthon standards. Her black chitons scarred and pitted from decades of combat. Her forearms folded across her armored chest, her bioluminescent patterns blazing in the sharp aggressive reds and oranges of Vorthon authority. Her eyes were like two chips of volcanic glass, set into a face that had been designed by evolution for one purpose and one purpose only. "You carry the spawn of traitors," Sithal said, and her voice came through the translator as a low rumble that the Fellaini on the bridge felt in their bones and their teeth. "They belong to a condemned bloodline. You will surrender them to us immediately." The bridge crew looked at their captain. Ylthra looked at her tactical officer, who shook his head slowly. The Athena's Mercy was a diplomatic frigate with minimal defensive systems and no meaningful offensive capability against a Vorthon dreadnought. She looked at her navigator, who was already calculating escape vectors and shaking her head too. The warship was too close and too fast. Every calculation said the same thing. "Comply." "War Matriarch," Ylthra began, and she hated the way her voice wavered. "The hatchlings were recovered from a disabled vessel in unclaimed space, under Galactic Coalition salvage law." "Your laws mean nothing to me," Sithal interrupted, and the contempt in her voice was so absolute that it did not even sound like anger. It sounded like a fact, like gravity, like the coldness of space. "Surrender the hatchlings, or we will take them. This is not a negotiation." From the back of the bridge, where she had come running the moment the alarms went off, with Ember still clinging to her chest and chirping in distress, Marin Cole spoke. "What will happen to them?" Every head turned. Sithal's volcanic eyes shifted to the human, this small, soft creature she had never seen before, holding a Vorthon hatchling against its body the way a Vorthon clan guardian would hold one of its own. The War Matriarch studied Marin for a long moment, and something flickered behind her eyes that was too fast and too alien to read. "They are of a flawed bloodline," Sithal said. "They will be dealt with according to our law." "What does that mean?" Marin pressed. "Specifically, what will happen to them? Say it clearly so everyone on this channel can hear it." Sithal's bioluminescent patterns shifted to a deeper shade of red, and she spoke a phrase in Old Vorthon that the translator could not fully render. Liul, who had been studying Vorthon linguistics for weeks now, went white. She said, he started, and then he had to stop and start again because his voice failed him. She said, "Flawed roots are burned, so the forest may grow straight. It means, Captain, it means they will kill them, all of them. They will erase the entire bloodline." Still, Marin looked down at Ember, who was pressed against her chest with all four arms wrapped around her, chirping softly, her bioluminescence pulsing in the warm, slow rhythm that meant she felt safe. She looked up at the view screen, where Sithal waited with the patience of a predator who had never been told no. She looked at Captain Ylthra, whose dark Fellaini eyes were filled with a fear so deep it had no bottom. "No," Marin said. The word was not shouted, and it was not whispered. It was spoken in the same clear and steady voice that Marin had used in the cargo hold of the derelict ship, when she told the captain that the hatchlings were going to die without help. It was the voice of someone who had made a decision. "No," she said again, "we are not giving them back." Sithal leaned forward on her command throne. "You would risk your entire ship for the spawn of a species that is not your own?" She was standing in front of the view screen, with Ember on her hip, and blood still visible on her hands from a dozen small bites and scratches that she had never bothered to bandage. These children were sealed in a freezing cargo hold by parents who loved them enough to die for them, she said. They were alone for weeks, starving and cold and terrified. And when we found them, we chose to help them. We fed them and warmed them and kept them alive, And they trust us now. They sleep in our arms, and they hum when we sing to them, and they follow us through the corridors of this ship like we are the only safe thing left in their world. She held Sithal's gaze. I will not hand a child over to be killed. Not today, not ever. Not for any reason that you or anyone else in this galaxy can give me. She turned to the communications console and opened an all-ship broadcast and a wide-spectrum external channel simultaneously so that the Vorthon warship and every ship in range would understand. Within range, could hear what she said next. My name is Specialist Marin Cole of the Galactic Coalition ship Athena's Mercy. We are currently sheltering 7 Vorthon hatchlings who were recovered from a derelict vessel and who are under our care and protection. These children are in good health and they are safe, and I am formally stating for the record that this vessel and its crew will not surrender them to be harmed. She looked at Captain Yelthara. The Felini captain was shaking, visibly and unmistakably shaking, her tall frame trembling from her ears to her hooves, with the full force of every fear her species had ever known. But she looked at Marin, and she looked at the hatchling in Marin's arms, and she looked at the view screen where the warship waited like death itself. And Captain Yelthara, prey animal, herbivore, a creature whose every ancestor for 1,000,000 generations had survived by running, opened her mouth and said the bravest thing she had ever said in her life. This is Captain Yelthara of the GCS Athena's Mercy. I confirm Specialist Cole's statement. These hatchlings are under the protection of this ship and its crew, and we will not surrender them. What happened next was something that no one on the bridge would ever forget. From her engineering station, Ven stood, and her crystalline plates rang out in a clear, bright tone that meant resolve. Crystallographer Ven, I stand with the captain. From the security station, Gorath rose on all 6 legs, and his armored body creaked as he drew himself up to his full height. Security Officer Gorath, I stand with the captain. From communications, Luel pressed his webbed hand over his racing heart and spoke in a voice that shook, but did not break. Communications Officer Luel, I stand with the captain. One by one, every station on the bridge spoke up, and then the calls started coming in from the rest of the ship. From engineering and medical and the science labs and the mess hall. Every species, every voice, every terrified beating heart on the Athena's Mercy, adding itself to the declaration. Even Sorrel, the Talari botanist, whose species had no vocal cords and who communicated only through light, stood in the botany lab and blazed so brightly that her glow was visible through 3 bulkheads. Sisial watched all of this. Her face was unreadable in the way that Vorthon faces were always unreadable to other species. All hard angles and black chitin and glowing eyes that gave nothing away. She spoke a command, and on the tactical display, the Vorthon warship's weapon systems powered up, and every screen on the Athena's Mercy lit up with targeting warnings, and the bridge filled with the soft and terrible sound of a ship that knew it was about to die. Minutes passed. Nobody moved, and nobody spoke, and the only sound was the chirping of the hatchling in Marin's arms. Then Sistal said something unexpected. Show them to me. Marin looked at the captain, who nodded. A visual feed from the nursery was opened and routed to the Vorthon warship, and Sistal saw 7 hatchlings in a nest of thermal blankets, surrounded by jury-rigged heating units and monitoring equipment, and the scattered evidence of weeks of desperate around-the-clock care. Empty nutrient paste containers and data readouts covered in handwritten notes, and a small speaker still playing the low-frequency lullaby tones that Liul had programmed. She saw the largest hatchling, Ridge, dragging an armored plate around the nest like a security blanket. She saw Flint curled up beside a crystalline thermal regulator that Ven had built, his bioluminescence pulsing in sync with its warming cycle as if it were a heartbeat. And she saw Ember, the smallest, the one who had nearly died, the one who should have died, asleep in the human's arms, with her face pressed against the human's neck, her entire body glowing in the slow, warm, steady rhythm that every Vorthon recognized. It was the deep safety signal, the bioluminescent pattern that hatchlings produced only when they felt completely and absolutely protected. A signal that Vorthon behavioral science said required the presence of a bonded clan guardian, someone the hatchling trusted with its life. The last time Sithal had seen that glow, it had been on her own children. She stared at the feed for a very long time. And then she cut the transmission, and the view screen went dark, and the targeting warnings kept flashing, and the crew of the Athena's Mercy waited to find out if they were going to live or die. The silence lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Then a new transmission came through. Not on the military channel, but on the old ceremonial frequency that the Vorthon used for formal declarations of honor, not been directed at a non-Vorthon species in recorded galactic history. It contained a single word in Old Vorthon, spoken in Sithal's voice, but stripped of all its previous authority and command. Spoken instead in the raw and ancient tone that the Vorthon used only for moments of genuine reverence. The universal translator processed the word and rendered it into galactic standard, and Lial read it aloud with tears running down his face. Keth Mara. Nobody on the bridge knew what it meant. Nobody except Lial, who looked at Marin with his glowing, tear-streaked face and said in a voice full of wonder, "It means clan-worthy. She has declared you clan-worthy. It is the highest honor in Vorthon culture, and it has never been given to an outsider." The weapons powered down. The targeting warnings disappeared, and in her arms, Ember chirped once and went back to sleep. War Matriarch Sith-Al boarded the Athena's Mercy alone. She came through the airlock, without weapons and without guards, and the sound of her footsteps on the deck plating was like thunder walking. Each step a deep, resonant impact that the crew felt through the soles of their feet and in the base of their spines. She was enormous, nearly 3 meters of black chitin and scarred armor, and coiled predatory power. And as she walked through the corridors of the diplomatic frigate, the crew parted before her like water before the bow of a ship. Some of them pressed themselves flat against the walls, and some of them backed into rooms and sealed the doors. And one young Mivari ensign fainted outright and had to be caught by a colleague before he hit the floor. Sith-Al noticed none of this, or if she did, she gave no sign of it. She walked with the focused purpose of someone who had traveled a very long way to see something important, and she did not stop, or slow until she reached Cargo Bay 4, where the nursery had been built, where the warmth and light spilled out through the open door like a campfire in the wilderness. Marin was standing in the doorway. She had Ember on her hip, the smallest hatchling's pale chitin pressed against the human side, all 4 arms wrapped tight, bioluminescence pulsing in that slow, warm rhythm that meant everything was safe. And she looked up at the War Matriarch with an expression that was neither defiant nor submissive. It was simply steady. Sith-Al stopped 3 paces away and looked down at the human. She was silent for a long time, and her volcanic eyes moved from Marin's face to the hatchling on her hip, to the bandages on Marin's hands, where the bite marks were still healing. And something shifted in the depths of those ancient eyes. Something that the prey species watching from around corners and through security feeds could not identify, but that Marin recognized. Immediately, it was the look of someone who was very tired of doing terrible things. "You are the one who went forward," Sisiel said, and her voice was different now, lower and rougher, and stripped of the commanding edge it had carried over the view screen. It was the voice she used when she was not performing the role of War Matriarch, but simply speaking as herself. "Your crew, they are prey species, all of them. Their fear is so strong I could taste it through the transmission, but you walked toward our young when they walked away." "They came back," Marin said quietly, Every single one of them came back. Sisial considered this. Yes, she said, that is perhaps even more remarkable. She looked past Marin into the nursery, and the 7 hatchlings looked back at her with wide pale eyes. And what happened next was something that Marin had not expected. The hatchlings were afraid. They pressed themselves against the back of the nest, and they hissed and flickered in sharp, distressed patterns. And even Ridge, the boldest of them, retreated behind the thermal regulator, with his armored plate clutched to his chest. They did not recognize Sisthal as safe. She was large and dark, and radiating the predatory energy that their instincts associated with danger. And they scrambled over each other to get to the one place in the nursery where they felt protected, behind Marin. 7 Vorthon hatchlings huddled behind a human who was smaller than any of them would eventually grow to be. And they chirped and clung to her legs and looked up at the massive war matriarch from around Marin's knees, as if this soft, warm, bite-scarred creature was the most powerful guardian in the galaxy. Marin stood between a Vorthon war matriarch and 7 hatchlings, one hand resting gently on Ember's back, and she did not move. Sisthal looked at this scene, really looked at it, and then she did something that sent a shockwave through every Vorthon cultural database in the galaxy. She knelt. A Vorthon warrior kneels before no one. This was a foundational principle of their society, as immovable as a law of physics, with one exception. A warrior kneels before a proven guardian of the young. The old laws said that any being who had demonstrated the willingness to fight and suffer and die to protect hatchlings that were not their own had earned the right to be recognized as a guardian, and a guardian was sacred, and before a guardian even a war matriarch bowed her head. Sithal pressed one of her 4 hands against the deck plating, and lowered her scarred and armored head until her eyes were level with Marin's, and from this position, the most vulnerable posture a Vorthon could assume, she spoke. "The clan you call the Emberkin," she said. "They were declared traitors by the ruling faction because they opposed the purification laws, the destruction of bloodlines deemed impure or defective. They were good people, and they were right, and they died because our leaders are cruel, and I was too much of a coward to protect them when it mattered." Her voice was heavy with something that needed no translation. "I was sent to destroy the last of their line," she continued. "I was sent to burn these children because that is what the law demands, and because I have spent my entire life following laws that I knew were wrong." She looked at the hatchlings peering out from behind Marin's legs. "But I watched your feed, and I saw what you have done, and I cannot do it. I have burned enough." The silence that followed was the deepest silence Marin had ever known. "There is an old law," Sithal said, "older than the faction that rules us, older than the purification laws, older than any living Vorthon's memory. It is called the Kethmara Binding. Under this law, any being who has been declared clan-worthy may claim guardianship of hatchlings, and those hatchlings become untouchable." She met Marin's eyes. "If you accept this, the hatchlings will be bound to you under Vorthon law. They will be yours to raise and protect, and no Vorthon, not even the ruling council itself, may harm them without challenging your honor as a guardian. And to challenge a Kethmara guardian is to challenge the oldest and most sacred law we have." She paused. "It will not make you popular among my people, but it will make the children safe." Marin looked down at Ember, who had climbed back onto her hip during the conversation, and was watching Sithal with wide, curious eyes, her fear fading as she realized that the large Vorthon was kneeling and speaking softly, and showing no sign of threat. Ember reached out one small clawed hand towards Sithal's scarred face. Sithal went very still. Ember touched the edge of a scar that ran along the war matriarch's jaw and chirped once, a questioning sound, a sound that meant in the simple language of all children everywhere, "Are you okay?" Something broke behind Sithal's volcanic eyes. something that had been held together by duty and obedience and the cold mathematics of power for a very long time. And for one brief moment, the war matriarch of the Silent Wrath was not a warrior or a commander or a weapon of the state. She was just someone who was tired of hurting children. "I accept," Marin said. 1 year later, the Joint Coalition Vorthon Research Station Hearthfire hung in orbit above a neutral world, and it was the first structure of its kind ever built. A place where the predators and the prey had chosen to work together, not because they had to, but because a human had shown them that they could. Marin walked through the station's main corridor with Ember beside her. And beside was the right word now, because Ember no longer clung to Marin's leg or rode on her hip. Ember walked on her own 4 legs, and she was growing fast, her chitin hardening and darkening from pale translucent to a deep warm copper that caught the light like polished metal, and she was already taller than most of the other species on the station, though she still chirped when she was happy, and still glowed in that slow, warm rhythm when she was near Marin. The other 6 hatchlings were thriving. Flint had bonded with crystallographer Ven, and could often be found in the engineering bay, helping her build things, or more accurately, taking apart things she had already built, and presenting the pieces to her like gifts, which Ven pretended to be annoyed about, and was secretly delighted by. Ridge had adopted Gorath as his personal hero, and followed the Pelvari everywhere, mimicking his defensive stances and his patrol routes, and Gorath trained him in basic security protocols with a gruff and tender patience that made the station's counselor cry at least once a week. 2 of the hatchlings, twins that Marin had named Spark and Kindle, had attached themselves to Liul, and would sit for hours while he sang to them, and they were beginning to sing back in harmonics that made the walls vibrate and the lights flicker. The youngest, after Ember, a shy and quiet hatchling named Drift, had surprised everyone by bonding with Sorrel, the Tulari botanist, the same Sorrel who had argued loudest against saving them, and the 2 of them spent their days in the station's garden, Drift's bioluminescence shifting to match the colors of whatever plant Sorrel was tending, as if the predator child was learning to speak in flowers. The 7th hatchling, Crest, the most independent of them all, roamed the station freely, and had become something of a mascot, appearing in laboratories and mess halls, and once memorably in the captain's quarters, where they ate an entire plate of diplomatic pastries, and showed no remorse. The Coalition and the Vorthon were not at peace, not yet. The political situation was complicated and fragile, and full of factions that wanted the old ways to continue, and the new ways to fail. But the door was open, and it had been opened not by a weapon or a treaty or a show of force, but by a human who had knelt on the cold floor of a dead ship and reached out her hand to something everyone else was afraid of. On the station's observation deck, Marin sat in her favorite chair by the wide window that looked out on the stars, and Ember curled around her like a massive armored cat, her copper chitin warm against Marin's side, her bioluminescence pulsing in the deep, steady glow of absolute safety, her 4 arms wrapped loosely around the human who had carried her out of the dark. The door to the observation deck hissed open, and a young Phalini ensign, newly assigned to the station, fresh from the academy, full of excitement and absolutely unprepared, stepped inside and froze. She stared at the scene before her, the human, the massive Vorthon juvenile, the casual and unmistakable intimacy of a bond that crossed every boundary the galaxy had ever drawn between species. And her dark Phalini eyes went as wide as moons, and her legs locked up, and her mouth fell open. Marin looked over and smiled. "She does not bite," she said. Then, after a beat, she added, "Well, not anymore." Ember lifted her head and looked at the ensign with glowing copper eyes, and chirped once, a warm and friendly sound that Leal's research had identified as the Vorthon equivalent of hello. The ensign was shaking from head to hoof. But she looked at Marin, and she looked at Ember, and she saw something that no briefing document or training manual could have prepared her for. She saw that the most feared predator species in the galaxy could glow like a sunset when it was happy. And she saw that a human could sit inside that glow like it was the most natural thing in the world. The ensign took a breath, and then another, and then she walked on trembling legs to the space beside Marin and sat down. Ember sniffed her once, a quick, curious intake of air through the sensory vents along her jaw, and then she rested her great copper head back on Marin's lap and closed her eyes and hummed. The ensign exhaled slowly. "She is warm," she whispered. "Yes," Marin said, and she put one hand on Ember's head and one hand on the ensign's shaking arm. "She is." Outside the window, the stars burned on in their ancient and patient way, and the station turned slowly in the light of a sun that did not care whether the creatures beneath it had claws or hooves or hands or leaves. It only cared that they were alive. And in the observation deck of a station that should not have existed, built by species that should have been enemies, a predator and a prey animal sat side by side. By side, with a human between them, and for one quiet moment, the galaxy was exactly what it had always had the potential to be. Not a place divided by teeth and fear and the old hard laws of who eats whom, but a place where someone could step forward when everyone else stepped back, and where that single act of stubborn and irrational and deeply human compassion could change everything. Ember glowed, the ensign stopped shaking, and Marin Cole sat in the warmth of both of them and watched the stars and smiled, because she had learned something a long time ago, on the cold floor of a dead ship, surrounded by frightened children who had teeth sharp enough to hurt her. The galaxy is vast and dark, and full of things that want to make you afraid, but the smallest light, the faintest glow, the weakest heartbeat refusing to stop, that is enough.